Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Noctory, boring ancient history stories for sleep. Today, we will dive into the most bizarre spy tricks in ancient history. A world where information was hidden in teacups, cat collars, and sometimes in a sad poem read out loud in the middle of a crowded market. Because sometimes the scariest person in a war isn't the one holding a sword. It's the one pretending to be blind, reading poetry, and knowing far too much. Before we begin, if you really find this a cozy place to escape the late hours, please like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly want to. Like the rules in an old tavern, you only need a spot if you're seeking quiet. And do you know what I love most? Looking at the comments to see where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Whether it's New York or Norway, 1 in the morning or 5 in the morning. You're here and I see you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a small fan if you have one. Not because it's hot, but because of that gentle hum. You step into the bathhouse. The light pours down from the dome, bathing the steam in a milky glow. The sound of water flowing steadily, the warm tiles beneath your feet, the sense of mint, musk, and ambergris fill the air with each breath you take. You don't rush to bathe, you wait. No one is watching you, and you aren't watching anyone. Because in this bathhouse, where the steam and whispers seem to merge, there's an invisible web of spies, most of whom are women. They don't need swords, they don't need armor, they just need the right scent at the right time. A courtesan, a servant, a healer. But here, they are all part of a silent espionage network, one that doesn't speak, only breathes. And you're here too. But who is really watching whom? Because in this space, a gaze is enough to behead someone, but a scent speaks volumes. You place your towel down. A woman walks past you. The towel she carries smells of Egyptian frankincense, something only found in the royal harem storeroom. You understand now. Tonight, the troops will withdraw from the eastern border. That wasn't perfume. That was a signal. In Byzantium, perfume wasn't just for fragrance. It was a language. And like any language, it had grammar, vocabulary, and of course, codes. A drop of rose, sharkim or harmless news. A whiff of sandalwood. A troop movement. But if you smell frankincense mixed with Persian musk, beware. Someone just declared war. Even in the harem, there was a scent code passed around, sewn into tunics or etched into the sides of perfume bottles. Not everyone could read, but everyone remembered the scent. In the Byzantine Empire, where rituals, palace plots, and wine blended with herbs, perfume was the third language. Behind each scent was a political journey. Frankincense, sandalwood, ambergris, and more were shipped from distant lands like Yemen, Egypt, and Persia. Those small bottles of oils weren't just beauty products. They were diplomatic gifts, trade goods between queens, or items tightly controlled by priests to ensure no scent ever betrayed a secret. It's said there was once a perfume that caused an entire court to lose sleep, because it appeared in the empress's private chamber, but came from a Persian merchant who had been accused of treason. And then there was the infamous poisoning incident of the year, where the victim simply walked into the steam room. No one touched him. No knives, no poisoned food. But someone had switched the herbs in the vapor. Mint for toxic root. As he inhaled deeply, as he always did, the poison filled his lungs. That scent couldn't be detected. Only the one who handed him the towel disappeared without a trace. Her identity was never uncovered. People just remembered. She smelled a little stronger than usual. It wasn't written on paper. It didn't need to be signed. Just one strange scent in the bathhouse, and the right person would understand. You're sitting in a cafe in 16th century Istanbul. The coffee is more bitter than usual. The smoke stings your eyes, and at your feet, there's a cat. It looks at you, not affectionately, not trustingly, just looking. You think it's hungry. You offer it a piece of meat. It flicks its tail, walks away. But you don't know. It just delivered a letter, a list of generals moving toward the eastern border. In the Ottoman Empire, where narrow alleys twisted like labyrinths and rooftops were as red as clay, cats were the only neutral creatures allowed to go anywhere. It wasn't by chance. In Islamic tradition, cats were beloved, seen as clean, refined creatures, and close to prophecy. Some say Prophet Muhammad once cut off part of his sleeve just to avoid disturbing a cat sleeping on his lap. And so, cats were not suspected. They wandered into temples, governors' palaces, bathhouses, as if they held diplomatic immunity, something even Venetian ambassadors wouldn't dare to ask for. And so, they became perfect spies. A cat could cross 3 markets, 2 mosques, and nap in the governor's courtyard without anyone noticing. And do you know what? Not every cat was chosen for this. Only those stubborn enough, knowing the way back, and disdainful enough were trained. Training a cat? Oh, it's not simple. You can't command them. You only lure them with special dried fish, familiar whistles, or the perfect sunlit windowsill. An Ottoman cat trainer once said, "I don't teach it to do anything. I only make it think it's its idea." And if anyone noticed, they just saw a fat cat looking for a sunny spot to roll over. A small, rolled-up letter, sealed in wax, hidden in a cloth collar or a silk belt, tied tight, but not too tight to be uncomfortable. The delivery? A single meow and a single flick of the tail. Sound absurd? Wait until you hear this. Though not many records state the names of individual spy cats, some Ottoman writings still contain clear references to using neutral animals to carry messages in markets. In a letter written in Old Ottoman, an official once warned, "News must travel as fast as a cat, soft as the wind, and silent as loyalty." No one could be sure whether that was a metaphor or intelligence training. It's said that in a 1570 campaign, a cat named Shaker, meaning candy, was trained to follow a fixed route between 2 fabric trading areas. Every time it arrived, it was fed salted roe, a fancy reward for a cat that knew too much. But then Shaker disappeared. 3 days later, it returned. No letter, no trace. And so, an Ottoman brigade was ambushed. No one knows whether the letter was stolen, or if the cat was bribed with something tastier. After that, they began interrogating cats. A real event recorded in verse. "My hands don't touch you, but this fish will speak for my heart." Think they were crazy? Maybe. But let's be honest. Amid soldiers whose loyalty was always changing, forged letters, and traders hiding everywhere, the cat was probably the most trustworthy. It didn't rewrite messages. It didn't ask questions. It just went and came back if it felt like it. An old officer once said, "At least the cat doesn't betray, unless there's grilled fish." What about humans? They betray even when hungry. But if you've ever lost a fortress just because a cat was a bit too slow, you'll understand why they started building tunnels just for cats, with checkpoints and 4-legged guards. In the late 16th century, Venetian merchants visiting Istanbul were warned, "Don't touch the cats, and if it meows, Don't answer, because in those soft meows there might be marching orders, or the belief that the person sitting next to you is a spy. You look up from your coffee. The cat has returned. It stares at you, this time a little longer, then walks away. No goodbye. You check your jacket pocket. Nothing. But you have the feeling someone just asked you to carry a message. And if you think cats are strange, wait until you meet the spy who uses tea, not to drink, but to draw maps with sugar. You're sitting in a tea house in Isfahan, the magnificent capital of the Safavid Empire. The tea steams. Mint fills your nose. On the other side of the table, a man pours tea without looking at you, but the way he places the sugar cube says it all. 3 cubes, arranged in an L shape, not a habit. Those are the coordinates for an attack. In 17th century Persia, tea wasn't just the leisurely pastime of intellectuals. At first, tea came to the land as a drink to calm the mind, brought by merchants from Central Asia and China. But soon, the Persians turned it into an art. Tea wasn't just for drinking, but for observing, for communicating, and for silently killing. Tea houses in Isfahan were where all social classes gathered, from monks and merchants to soldiers and courtesans. News, rumors, orders, and betrayals were all diluted in hot water and served up on the surface of the cup like steam. It was a language, a code dissolving in the hot liquid. The tea master didn't need books. He just needed to remember a round sugar cube, good news, a square sugar cube, urgent warning, a cube that fell off the tray. Someone is listening. Because sugar wasn't just for sweetness. It carried shapes, it bore marks, and sometimes it carried deadly intent. Some spies were trained just to taste events. They knew who was about to betray, simply by licking the rim of the cup. A pinch of cinnamon, news from the north, a drop of honey. Danger is near, a slice of lemon on the edge of the cup. A change of target, and the recipient just needed to sip slowly. Tea was never poured to the brim, because the empty space in the cup was the untold message. They say, at the court of Shah Abbas I, there was a mute tea master. Legend has it he was once a spy, caught, interrogated, and had his tongue cut out so he couldn't speak secrets. But instead of being killed, he was spared for his ability to pour tea perfectly, frighteningly. He remained in the palace as a shadow, the silent tea servant. Every gesture, every tilt of his hand was an unspoken political agreement. No one heard his voice, but he brought down an entire court just by changing the order of the teacups for the generals. Once, he placed a cup of tea with wilted mint on the right side of the marshal. The next day, a fort on the eastern border was left unguarded. You glance at the teacup before you, golden brown. A red speck floats, suspended. You don't ask. You just silently touch your finger to the edge of the cup, as if wiping away the mist. But really, you're responding. The message has been received. The plan is about to unfold. In Safavid culture, knowing without speaking was the pinnacle of virtue and power. Some give orders with words. Some just move their finger when pouring boiling water. And sometimes, true power lies with the one behind the scenes, holding the teapot, saying nothing, but changing history with a slice of lemon placed just off center. One word could start a war, but one wrong drop of tea could make an entire army vanish. The more you know, the slower you sip. The more dangerous you are, the more you smile gently as you drink. A Persian poet once wrote, "I know nothing, but my tea knows everything." You rise. The tea master bows slightly. No one greets you. No one sees you off. But someone will die tonight. And if you think tea as a messenger is bizarre, wait until you meet the woman who embroiders war maps in her flower patterns. You are standing in a small weaving workshop on the outskirts of Shiraz. The loom beats steadily. The air carries the scent of coarse fabric, dust, and dried jasmine. A woman is bowing her head, embroidering a general's robe. The pattern looks harmless. A few sprigs of grass, a bird's wing, a few drifting clouds. But if you look closely, they are forming a map. In 16th century Persia, where women were forbidden to carry weapons, they found something sharper than a knife, a needle. Embroidery was one of the few skills women were allowed to learn, kept after marriage, and considered a safe occupation. But precisely because it was undervalued, it became the ideal hiding place for the most dangerous things. In noble families, girls often began learning embroidery at the age of 7, but a few were taught not just how to thread a needle, but how to encode information, so that the position of a lotus petal, whether upright or inverted, could change the course of a military campaign. A needle doesn't kill, but it carries messages. Those in the craft called it the flower code, a sophisticated system of symbols hidden within each petal, each twist of the thread. An upright lotus meant attack. An inverted lotus meant retreat. 2 parallel golden threads signified royalty has moved. And if there was a small blue dot added, it meant change the direction of the march within 3 days. Everything had meaning. Beauty was just the disguise. The message was in every stitch. One misaligned stitch, one unnecessary knot, one petal slightly curved, could all be orders for a military march, a base camp map, or an assassination schedule. A piece of hand-embroidered lace at a wedding party could conceal the name of a treacherous spy. A piece of fabric adorning a headscarf could reveal the troop strength of the nearest garrison. You think that's a coincidence? No. The woman spent 3 years learning how to embroider like that. And she didn't embroider for beauty. She embroidered so that no one would survive if they decoded it. People tell of a strange trial. A girl was accused of treason simply because her sister's wedding dress had an embroidered crane in reverse. That crane, according to a witness, only appeared in the border map symbols used by the Safavid military. And so, she was hanged upside down for 3 days to see if anything fell out from the seams. An envoy from the Mughal Empire was once amazed to see a Persian woman embroider the entire structure of a governor's palace, using only red thread, silver thread, and a handkerchief. Embroidery on silk was considered the pinnacle, not just because it was beautiful, but because silk was hard to detect faults in. A misaligned stitch would leave a mark. An unnecessary stitch would ruin the fabric. And that's why, if you wanted to hide the most important information, you'd choose silk. A forger was executed just because his lotus flower had 1 petal, slightly longer than convention. In the craft, a longer petal could mean move back 5 miles. But in warfare, that's the difference between life and death. He didn't bring back the map. He brought back the handkerchief. It still smelled like star anise. You stand there, watching the woman bow her head, her hand slightly trembling. Not because of fear, but because each stitch is a choice, life or death. You sneeze lightly. She glances at you and smiles, very gently, like she just confirmed a signal. In a world where words can be intercepted, where papers can be seized, the needle on fabric is the last weapon of wisdom. A map can burn. A military order can be exposed. But who would suspect a flower? A courtier once said, "The ancient Persians had many verses about silk and destiny." In an old folk song, they sang, "I don't know where she went, but the hem of her dress is embroidered with a dagger's edge." No one asked the meaning, but everyone avoided the gaze when they encountered a dress with slightly crooked patterns, silver thread a little too thick, and lace edges resembling a warning written in thread. If you see unusual embroidery on a soldier's cloak, don't think it's art. It might be the end for you. And if you think embroidery is a harmless craft, then wait until the next chapter, where a blind old man. Just reading a poem is enough to make an entire army turn back. You are standing before the gates of Constantinople. It's not quite dawn yet. The sea breeze still carries a salty tang, and the sun hasn't yet decided whether it will rise. To your right, a man is wearing a thick coat, holding a staff, his eyes bleary. He nods to the guards and repeats the phrase he's said every day for the past 31 years. The southern gate is secure. The western gate is still loose. The northern gate, awaiting update. Everyone laughs when they hear him. There's a rumor he was once the logistics officer, demoted after a mishap, but kept around because he was on time and always accurate. A living clock, an organic repeating device. The city, though changing generals and emperors, kept him, because no one wanted to redo the guard schedule if he disappeared. They called him the repeating man. He has no rank, no weapons. No one knows where he came from. All they know is that if he doesn't speak at the right time, the guards won't open the gate. One day, he got a fever. Some thought it was nothing. But within the ranks, the guards began to worry. For over the years, every faction in the city had secretly interpreted his phrase in their own way. The military saw it as a code for the status of the walls. The merchants used it to predict supply updates. The clergy saw it as a sign from God, the three gates corresponding to the three divine entities. So when the phrase didn't ring out, all three factions panicked. No one heard the familiar phrase. The gate team opened late by 15 minutes, and in those 15 minutes, a group carrying supplies was replaced by spies. From that day on, he was given a special chair with a canopy, and his phrase was added to the city's historical record, not for its content, but for its rhythm. They say the phrase was a code, and not just any code. In Byzantine military texts, there was a rule. If you can't verify the source, check the rhythm, because a spy can mimic voice, mimic posture, but it's hard to fake the familiar cadence of a phrase repeated for 3 decades. That phrase became a behavioral identifier. If someone was off rhythm, off tone, it was a sign. Something was wrong within, a periodic beat. If the tone is off, if the emphasis is wrong, it's a sign something is amiss. You ask, does he know what he's saying? He shrugs, smiles, and repeats in the exact same tone. The southern gate is secure. The western gate is still loose. The northern gate, awaiting update. No one remembers his face. The guards are trained to hear his voice as a reflex. They don't need to analyze. They don't need to understand the content. They only need a familiar tone, a steady rhythm, no haste or hesitation, like a heartbeat, like the wind blowing in the right season. If he misemphasizes a word, the guards will tighten their grip on their sword hilt, not out of fear, but because their brains signal something is wrong. But everyone remembers his voice, the steady, emotionless voice without any rise or fall. a sound that makes you think you're hearing stone speak, or an outdated software repeating commands from a bygone dynasty. One night, a Byzantine spy disguised himself as a guard and tried to replace him. He memorized the phrase, mimicked the voice perfectly, but the guards still didn't open the gate. The reason? His breath was off, and he didn't emphasize the word awaiting properly. Constantinople wasn't just held by stone walls, it was held by consistency, by old, repeated phrases, by habit, by the sound of a staff tapping on the brick every morning, and by a man no one cared about, until he was no longer there. He wasn't a spy, he wasn't a general, he just never got a phrase wrong. And if you think danger only comes from what changes, then you should pay more attention to what repeats, too perfectly. You are crossing a scorching stretch of desert in the Arabian Peninsula. The sun is so hot, even the wind is dry. Each step the camel takes is a deep drumbeat, resonating in your spine. In front of you, the camel driver, a hunchbacked figure with rough hands, mouth shut like a sealed jar. He hasn't asked where you're going. He only says, "Keep silent, and if anything falls out of the camel's belly, don't pick it up." In the ancient Arabian world, camels weren't just transportation. They were part of a living intelligence network, what we now call caravan intelligence. In the merchant caravans running the spice routes from Petra to Damascus, some camels were trained to stop at signals, turn abruptly, or even tap their hooves 3 times on a rock if they were carrying special cargo. Not everyone could see it, but once you did, you didn't need to say anything. They were living mailboxes, and some of them were trained to hide goods in their second stomach. You didn't hear wrong. The second stomach, the reticulum, doesn't digest. It holds things that shouldn't be destroyed, stones, hard seeds, and in some cases, secret information. Merchants would wrap paper in processed lambskin soaked in vinegar. They would even stuff it with aromatic herbs and dill, both to mask the smell and to help it be regurgitated. The trainers called it living mail, a method of messaging that could be chewed again. Camels have multiple stomachs, and merchant caravans secretly knew exactly which stomach didn't digest but only held. While the West hid letters in hats, combs, or even bread, here, the Arabs chose the second stomach. Not glamorous, not poetic, but does anyone check a camel's intestines in the middle of the desert? No, because they're busy surviving. And that's why camels, though smelly and slow, remained the safest method of communication in the old world. Documents were wrapped in dried fish skin, placed in a pouch, and swallowed by the camel. Upon arrival, all it took was a small herb, and the animal would regurgitate all the information. A merchant from Petra once said, "Humans betray, ink smears, but a camel, if it doesn't die on the road, it will surely return." Your guide suddenly dismounts. He doesn't say anything. He only drops a salt tablet at the camel's feet, and the animal regurgitates a small leather pouch. You don't look, because you don't want to know. But you see his hand, slightly trembling. Then he turns to you and says, "If anyone asks, the smell came from dried fish." In that world, where paper could be burned in a sandstorm, they trusted the walking, drinking animal that never asked questions. There's a legend that a caravan of camels carrying secret letters crossed the desert for 6 days without rest. But there's also a record saying a caravan of camels was burned alive in Damascus, suspected of carrying counterfeit letters. Only one camel survived, and inside its stomach, they found a small map, marking the position of the insurgent forces. That document, though nearly burned with the stomach, turned the tide of the campaign. No one knew who sent the letter, but they remembered. That camel died with its jaw still chewing. By the time it reached its destination, only one camel survived. They dissected it, and in its third stomach, they found the counterattack map of an entire dynasty. You look back at the camel you're riding. It doesn't make a sound. It just chews steadily, slowly, as if pondering the secrets someone left behind. As night falls, the camel driver starts a fire, saying nothing. He only murmurs, "If information is water, then the camel is the sealed vessel, and I am the thirsty one, but never drink." And if you think intelligence only involves humans, wait until the next chapter, where a puppet knows how to dance on command, with no strings attached. You are standing in a green-tiled hall, in the middle of Isfahan. A light breeze blows through the high arches, carrying the scent of aged wine and dried orange peels. You are not a guest. You are the one pouring the wine. In thin silk, barefoot, eyes lowered. You listen, but do not look. You remember, but do not repeat. You pour, one drop at a time, for those who are deciding the fate of an entire empire. In the Safavid court, being a wine server was not just a job. Sometimes it was also a test. A king once pretended to be drunk and mistakenly called the name of a general, just to see if anyone would repeat him. The first person to report it was executed. Meanwhile, the wine server stood there, holding the tray, eyes still lowered, as if hearing nothing but the sound of wine falling into the glass. And that's why he was kept. It was an art of intelligence, because when people are drunk, that's when words slip past the barricades. The Persians of old believed wine does not make people forget. Wine simply removes the defenses. The drunk often says what they try to hide during the day, and they say it with a strange lightness, as if secrets were made to be drunk with ripe grapes and mint. You don't force confessions. You just pour and wait. A prince whispers the name of his lover. A high-ranking official accidentally insults the king. A general reads a secret order without realizing it. All of it falls into the ears of the server. You are not allowed to speak, because you are a kademikas, a servant who remembers, not writes. In the Safavid court, some servants were chosen only to listen and remember. They were not allowed to hold a pen. They were not allowed to transcribe anything. But each night, they whispered the entire party back to the royal advisors, as if they had a living recording inside their heads. You are the memory of the empire, with no power, but with a memory. You are not allowed to leave. You are not allowed to act as though you know. But you remember every word, every breath. Once you poured with the wrong hand. The wine spilled onto the silk rug. The entire room fell silent, but the general, who had been talking about attacking the east, suddenly stopped and changed to postpone. Just because you looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, then lowered your head. A server's glance, if timed correctly, can change the entire plan. It could be a warning. It could be an agreement. It could be bait. Some say the Safavid kings did not trust professional spies. They trusted the ones closest to the wine, because wine is where power melts into words. One legend tells that a female wine server learned of an assassination plot against the emperor. She didn't speak. She just poured the wine stronger than usual and shifted half a step. Thanks to that, the emperor became suspicious and escaped death. She wasn't rewarded. She wasn't punished. She just kept pouring. You pour the wine like you breathe, like you are diluting news with the scent of flowers, to let someone hear without knowing they've just heard something important. Tonight, a high official is drunk. He says, we should attack Shirvan before winter. You don't nod, you don't react, you just pour a little more, but your hand shakes slightly, enough to tilt the wine in the glass. And so, the war begins a week later. The servers don't go to battle. The generals hold the maps. You hold the wine. But it's you who knows who will betray, who will survive, and who will never return. Because wine doesn't lie. Only the drunk do. No sword. No horse. Just a silver tray. And a glance that could shake an empire. You are standing on the roof of a Roman villa near Alexandria. The sky is brightening, and there's a distinct sound. The wind passing through the wings of a bird. Not a wild bird. Not a bird of Thoth or the goddess Athena. But a trained bird. One raised to return. One trained to fly right and live wrong. Messenger birds, Avis nuntia, have been used since ancient Egypt. The Egyptians would release birds from temples of Horus to send messages between priests. The Babylonians called them breaths with a path. And when they reached the Romans, these creatures were no longer spiritual symbols. They became the postal infrastructure, an empire built on stone, but connected by wings. But under the Romans, they became tools of espionage. They didn't carry official messages. They carried drafts. They carried encrypted messages hidden beneath their feathers. Not on paper, but on their very bodies. Some were marked with black grape ink on the third feather of their right wing. The inspector, if unaware, would only see a faint mark, but the right person would read the instructions. Turn the troops, delay the army, or retreat overnight. You look at the bird owner. He's not a nobleman, just a hunchback who lives next to the public baths. But every morning he releases 3 birds, one towards the palace, one towards the port, and one. No one knows where it goes. What do the birds carry? A red thread, a gem, a small ring with an engraved symbol. They say, if a bird doesn't return, there's something wrong. If all 3 return, but not at the same time, there's betrayal. If a bird returns with a torn wing, someone is trying to steal information. But the real cost isn't in the bird. A human can love and betray, but a bird, if trained right, will die on the road, not land on a strange roof. In a world full of treachery, this mute creature becomes the symbol of loyalty, not because of ethics, but because of instinct. And the trainer. Once, at the Alexandria market, Roman soldiers caught a bird with a piece of dried skin hidden under its foot. The piece of skin didn't write anything. It only had 3 dots, enough to make the entire Eastern Supply Depot's shipping schedule be changed. The bird keeper was interrogated for 3 days. He said nothing. He didn't resist. He just kept repeating, I only let them go. I don't know where they fly. No one believed him, but no one killed him. Because without him, the birds wouldn't fly. And if the birds don't fly, the empire is blind to information. You ask, why not use a person? They reply, because birds don't need wages. They don't need loyalty, and if they die, they don't betray. A bird is set free, but it flies on schedule. The bird's wings are freedom, but freedom isn't in the flight, it's in choosing where to land. And these birds never had that choice. They eat on time, and if they're late, they could change an entire political outcome. And you, standing there, don't know if today you're releasing a letter or releasing a declaration of war. You are in the city of Jerusalem during the reign of King Herod. The shadows stretch long, and the city walls are damp with early morning mist. No one speaks. No one laughs. The signal is not a glance. It is the trembling finger moving in rhythm as the sleeve falls down. The Jews call this the royal finger signal, a form of writing without ink, but enough to change the fate of the one in front of you with just one motion. And some people pass by each other without ever making eye contact. A spy just emerged from the carved tunnels beneath the temple. His sleeve has a red thread stain, not a symbol, but a written word that only the knowledgeable could read. A command, a name, a death sentence, folded neatly into the folds of his sleeve. In Herod's time, a person's name was never spoken openly. Those being followed would never be called by name. They were only referred to by their position on the wall, the color of their shoelaces, the tilt of their head when drinking water. Some called it a letter without paper, a form of communication that leaves nothing behind, because the body itself is the channel. You see a gatekeeper bending his fingers 4 times, not because of a deformity, but because when he bends the 4th finger, someone will lightly tap the 7th brick window. The city wall isn't solid. It has vents, gaps that are marked beforehand with carved sand or charcoal marks. Tapping the 7th brick at the 9th hour is enough for someone inside the palace to understand. It's time to act. No words, no letters. Just stone and reverberation. No one says a word, but someone is assassinated that night. Herod used hundreds of people with no titles, no salary, no records, but they had reserved seats at the festivals, and if someone sat in that seat, they had written their own death sentence. You ask, so why isn't their name recorded in history? Herod didn't just kill, he erased. The names of those sentenced weren't written, weren't mentioned. The court's history was edited weekly, and each time a royal decree changed, it was like someone vanished. Not because they never existed, but because they were struck from the page as if they had never been there. What does history record when there are no words? And perhaps those without names also have no crime, because you can't judge what isn't recorded. History only records those who speak. As for those who only raise a hand, and even the palace falls with it, no one remembers what their name was. A Jewish historian once said, "There are those who live without being mentioned, but as long as they don't signal, the dynasty will fall." Do you see it? A head tilt, a trembling finger, a glance that's off rhythm. All of it could be a death sentence. The outcome of the war is not in the battle letters, but in the shadow on the wall, and the person who walks through it still doesn't know they were just chosen. If you're still awake, sitting in the faint light of the 21st century, know this: history is not only written in blood, sometimes it is whispered by those whose names no one remembers anymore. Hugh Capet, founder of the Capetian dynasty, Embroidery. On Christmas Day, 800, amidst the incense smoke and the chanting echoing through the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a symbolic moment took place. Pope Leo III approached, placing a golden crown on the head of a tall Frankish warrior, and declared loudly. Some records suggest that Charlemagne was unaware of the coronation. While he was praying, the Pope suddenly placed the crown on his head. If that's true, then this moment of restoring the Roman Empire was a subtle imposition by the Church. Carolus Magnus, Emperor of the Romans. Charlemagne, the ruler of the Franks, was officially crowned Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans, reborn after more than 3 centuries of collapse. And so, in that moment, an old dream was revived, the restoration of the Roman Empire in Europe. A new Rome, no longer in Italy, but in the north, where pine forests bordered the cold sea and the Germanic tribes lived. An empire that was not. Franz Charlemagne did not rule France, because France did not yet exist. What he created was a collection of territories stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe River, from Denmark to Italy. A unified empire by the sword, bound by Catholic faith, and operated on personal loyalty. Under his rule, everything was imperial. No nation, no national borders, no unified legal system. Only the throne, the cross, and the command. The contradiction within glory. If Julius Caesar paved the way for the Roman Empire through political reforms, Charlemagne tried to restore it through faith and the sword. One man ahead of his time, the other, out of sync with his own era. Caesar killed the Republic to establish the empire. Charlemagne received the crown from the Pope, as one granted mercy, not as the conqueror of Rome. These were 2 very different paths, but they cast the same ancient shadow. Charlemagne's empire was vast, but fragile. Inside, it was a mix of different peoples: Franks, Saxons, Bavarians, Lombards, Visigoths. No common language, no solid tax system, no powerful bureaucracy to run things from the center. Charlemagne was the only central authority, but he was not immortal. Death and the power vacuum. While Charlemagne's empire seemed to operate by sword and power, he also initiated the first intellectual revival in medieval Europe. In Aachen, he founded a palace school where the monk Alcuin taught Latin, writing, and copied ancient books. An emperor commanding education. And so, amidst a world of forests and warfare, he established a fragile smoke of ancient knowledge, a flame that would ignite again in the 12th century. When he died in 814, his only surviving son, Louis the Pious, ascended the throne, and from here the empire began to crack. His grandsons did not inherit the glory. They only inherited a map too large to control and a concept of power with no mechanism to sustain it. Charlemagne recreated the Roman Empire, but he did not create a modern system of governance. He built castles in the sand, grand and beautiful, but crumbling after just 1 generation. An old Roman dream, out of place, out of time. Charlemagne thought he was restoring Rome, but in reality, 9th century Europe was no longer the land of Roman emperors. It was the land of lords, families, and warrior oaths. He spoke the emperor's language, but future generations understood the language of vassals and territories. Charlemagne planted the seed for an ancient dream, but the era he lived in was the land of new things taking shape: national consciousness, feudalism, and the belief that a country was no longer an empire, but a community with borders. Charlemagne is remembered as the father of Europe, but most of what he left behind is just legend and borders. Both modern Germany and France consider him their ancestor. In a divided Europe, torn by language and borders, Charlemagne, a king who spoke German, wrote in Latin, and ruled from France, became a symbol of unity beyond borders. A Frank who was the last Roman emperor, and at the same time, the invisible founder of the European Union. He pioneered the idea of divine power, but because it was so grand and unstable, the empire he built became too long a shadow, making his descendants live forever in conflict. He did not create France, but France could only be born after Charlemagne's dream had shattered. When Charlemagne died in 814, he left behind a vast empire and an unresolved inheritance problem. His son, Louis the Pious, succeeded him. But Louis was not a warrior by blood. He was a devout believer. And after Louis, the empire wasn't just inherited. It was split into 3 parts by Charlemagne's 3 grandsons, 3 men, 3 egos, 3 ambitions, and a split that shaped all of Europe. 3 bloodlines, 3 storms. These 3 grandsons were Lothair, the eldest, who held the title of emperor and the central part of the empire, a narrow stretch of land from Italy to the North Sea. Louis the German, the second, who took the eastern part, the land that would become Germany. Charles the Bald, the youngest, who received the western part, the land that would later become France. It seemed fair, but in reality, it was the recipe for division. The tragedy: the empire split before it had a map in 843. After years of civil war between the 3 brothers, the Treaty of Verdun was signed. This wasn't just a treaty. It was the first slash of a political wound across Europe's body. A line drawn not just geographically, but through language, culture, and power. It was the moment an empire became 3 identities, and each identity began to consider itself a country. And so, from a Roman emperor, Germany and France began to take shape. Lothair, the emperor without a throne. Ironically, the one who held the title of emperor was the weakest of the 3. Lothair's land, stretching from the North Sea to Italy, wasn't a unified bloc, but a patchwork territory, difficult to control and lacking a clear center. Lothair was trapped between his 2 brothers, who had armies, contiguous lands, and the support of the nobility. His throne, though noble, lacked real military protection. Among the 3, Lothair was the one who kept the title of emperor, but that title had become just a facade. He was not revered by his people. He could not control the lords. He couldn't unite a long and difficult-to-manage land like Middle Francia. Lothair bore Charlemagne's name, but was caught between 2 realities. His brothers were growing stronger, and the throne was empty. Louis and Charles, the birth of 2 nations. In contrast, Louis the German and Charles the Bald began laying the first foundations of 2 great nations, Germany and France. They began speaking the language of the land, accepting local lords, and even swearing oaths in the native tongues, marking the first time in history that a political oath was spoken not in Latin, but in Old German and Old French. This event was the Oath of Strasbourg in 842. Charles the Bald swore in German so Louis's soldiers could understand, and Louis the German swore in Romance, the precursor to French, so Charles's soldiers could hear. It was the first time in European history that political language was no longer Latin, but the language of the people. This wasn't just the beginning of 2 states. It was the end of the idea of universal Roman rule. The Treaty of Verdun, a map that bled. This treaty not only changed the map, but it left a profound psychological shock. The people of the empire, once subjects of Charlemagne, suddenly became the French, the Germans, names that hadn't even formed in national consciousness. They no longer knew to whom they belonged. Bishops argued, lords eyed each other with suspicion, and the concept of emperor was first questioned. If you look at the map of Europe after 843, you don't see clear boundaries. But if you overlay the names Francia Orientalis, Francia Occidentalis, and Lotharingia, you're seeing 3 embryonic political ideas and 3 names that suggest the future. Francia Orientalis, later Germany. Francia Occidentalis, later France. Lotharingia, to be torn apart, disputed for centuries. A land always caught between the French-German wars, from Napoleon to Hitler. Symbol: a wound that never healed. The Treaty of Verdun didn't just divide 3 lands. It divided 3 types of power. An empire sanctified by divinity, Lothair. A kingdom tied to local identity, Louis. A royal power that first grasped national symbols, Charles. From here, the concept of France was no longer a shadow in the West, but an entity growing from the ashes of the Frankish Empire. Charlemagne dreamed of a unified Europe, but his descendants and the blood of his own line drew the first borders. The Treaty of Verdun wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a paradox. The more Europe tried to hold on to the dream of unity, the more it fragmented into regions, into languages, into kings, each with their own definition of power. And like a curse, from that moment on, every time the French and Germans looked at each other, they saw the shadow of a family that never parted peacefully. While the Frankish kings were still mending the wounds of Verdun, from the north, another child of chaos made its way into the funeral march of history. Longships, shaped like dragons, each with a dragon's head placed on the Seine, Loire, and Rhine rivers, brought names that Europe would never forget. Ragnar, Siegfried, Ivar, Harald. The Vikings came like a tidal wave and left like an illusion. But that illusion left behind burning piles of unfinished ashes. Unveiling the system. In 845, Ragnar Lodbrok, with 120 warships, entered the Seine and raided Paris. No central force could stop them. They burned houses, took hostages, and only withdrew after receiving a massive ransom. Since 793, when Lindisfarne was sacked, all of Europe had smelled the smoke. But the Franks were still debating who should receive which land. With their light, thin ships, the Vikings moved on rivers as if on flat land, burning cities, monasteries, and fortresses. At the time, the Frankish kingdoms were still tangled in fraternal wars, with no central authority left to represent, coordinate, or defend the territory. The Carolingian system relied on central power. Once that central authority collapsed, the legs would either run away or fall apart. Monasteries plundered, lords in ruins. Not all lords were attacked. Some of them hired the Vikings as allies. They paid gold to the Vikings to fight political enemies. They opened the monastery gates to avoid being burned. Wherever there was a benefit, there was a deal. Churches were looted. Bishops fled. Property was plundered. The whole region of the Seine and Loire reeked of rotting corpses. On the other side, the lords were holding meetings with the Vikings. In many regions, the Vikings were even given land in exchange for protection. The central role of the Frankish kings disappeared. The Franks learned loyalty again. On the old altar of the empire, only charred Bibles and the ashes of Carolingian charters remained. Libraries collapsed. The Saint-Denis monastery, once a symbol of royal power, was now just a temporary refuge for refugees. In panic, lords became little kings of their domains. The people no longer looked to distant kings. They looked to the lords who held swords to protect their villages. The remnants of the Carolingian Empire were officially rendered powerless. Feudalism was not born from a name. It was born from fear. In panic, lords became little kings of their domains. The people no longer looked to distant kings. They looked to the lords who held swords to protect their villages. The remnants of the Carolingian Empire were officially rendered powerless. Feudalism was not born from a name. It was born from fear. And so, Normandy was born. Normandy was not a natural land. It was a political Frankenstein, born of raiders, nurtured by Frankish power. speaking French, but still holding the Viking soul. The Viking lords in Normandy would become nobles, but at their core, they still carried the dream of the sea. And when they looked toward England, a land rich yet fractured, they saw an opportunity to prove that the exiled can return and claim a crown. In 911, the Frankish dynasty was left with only one option: to negotiate with the raiders. King Charles ceded the region of Rouen to the Vikings in exchange for loyalty, and thus Normandy was born. The Vikings came, settled, and became Franks. From raiders to lords, from lords to kings, and in a still fragile new order, the Viking clans would live, marry, have children, and later invade England. Europe after Verdun was no longer an empire. It was a land with groups of people rising in panic. When Charles the Bald, a Carolingian descendant, abandoned Paris in the face of the Viking storm in 885, it wasn't a king who stood up to defend the city. It was a count named Eudes. Not everyone fully understood the significance of that moment, but history did. For the first time since Charlemagne, someone not of the Carolingian bloodline, but a lord, was honored by the people and nobility as a true king. The count amidst the sea of flames. The Seine was thick with hundreds of Viking longships. The sound of war drums echoed, mixing with the screams and the crackling of roofs being set on fire. The scent of burning flesh, rotting wood, and corpses mixed together, creating a living nightmare. At the gun emplacements, Parisian soldiers gripped their spears with trembling hands. They weren't waiting for a king. They were looking at one man, Eudes, the only one still riding through the Viking siege, shouting defense orders and cutting a bloodied path to call for reinforcements. The siege of Paris lasted nearly a year. It rained, disease spread, hunger crept into every corner. But Eudes, Lord of Paris, did not flee. He rode through the Viking blockade twice to call for reinforcements. When help arrived, it was not Charles the Bald who commanded. It was Eudes who drove the invaders back. His name was sung across the region of Île-de-France. Paris did not fall, and Eudes did not bow. Royal power in hand, not in blood. Charles the Bald, the official king, was praying. He did not send soldiers, did not appear, and nearly vanished from the scene. Many Frankish nobles saw him as useless. The nobles' council after Charles's death became a battlefield of words. One side wanted to keep the Carolingian tradition, while the other said bluntly, "The one who holds the sword and defends Paris is the true king." The church hesitated. Some bishops opposed Eudes because he lacked holy blood, but many monasteries he saved from Viking destruction stood by him. For the first time, the church was divided on the issue of kingship. Charles the Bald, the official king, was praying. He did not send soldiers, did not appear, and nearly vanished from the scene. Many Frankish nobles saw him as useless. The nobles' council after Charles's death became a battlefield of words. One side wanted to keep the Carolingian tradition, while the other said bluntly, "The one who holds the sword and defends Paris is the true king." In 888, Charles the Bald died. The Frankish nobles gathered, and instead of choosing another Carolingian, they elected Eudes as king. A first crack in the myth of divine bloodline. Eudes was not king of the entire kingdom, but he was the first to prove that power doesn't only come from lineage, but also from the sword raised at the right moment. The temporary ruler, the builder of long-term foundations, Eudes' reign was short-lived. After his death, the throne returned to the Carolingians with Charles the Simple, but the consequences didn't disappear. Eudes' family, the Robertians, retained the county of Paris. They didn't need the throne. They had land, monasteries, and the loyalty of many smaller lords. They didn't rule by a throne. They sat down and waited. Eudes' sword was not just a weapon, but a new political symbol. When he stood on the walls of Paris, sword raised, it was no longer defense, but a ritual proclamation of kingship by action. Eudes did not leave a son to rule, but he left behind an idea. If the king can no longer protect his people, then the people will elevate someone else to be king. Eudes' defense of Paris laid the groundwork for two things: noble authority surpassing that of the king when the king is powerless, the rise of the Robertian family, who would later give rise to Hugh Capet, the founder of the Capetian dynasty. Eudes is proof that in the post-Carolingian broken world, a sword raised at the right moment can change the very bloodline of the throne. And while the Carolingian emperors still dreamed of an empire, Eudes, the man with only one city, began to reconstruct the concept of kingship. Eudes did not leave a son to rule, but he left behind an idea. If the king can no longer protect his people, then the people will elevate someone else to be king. When Eudes passed away, the Franks temporarily closed the chapter of resistance. The throne once again returned to the Carolingian family, as if everything had returned to the old order. But in reality, every old order had quietly rotted from within. No need for a throne, just roots. The family of Eudes, the Robertians, did not disappear with him. They didn't establish a kingdom. They established a network of territories, monasteries, and oaths of loyalty from local counts. They didn't need crowns. They did what the Carolingian Empire could never do. They took root in the land. They became known as the Holy Counts, not for their divine power, but because of the Saint Martin de Tours monastery, which their ancestors had patronized since 865. It was here that the cloak of Saint Martin was kept, and it was also here that a new symbol of power would be born: cracks in the Carolingian throne. Power under the Carolingians was a divine right legitimized by bloodline. Kings were anointed, sanctified, and succeeded as though it was God's will. But when territorial divisions turned the kingdom into a fragmented pie, power began to leak away from the throne. While the kings argued over titles and genealogies, local lords built walls, stocked supplies, and made their own oaths of loyalty. The Robertians understood this sooner than anyone else. They didn't struggle to become kings. They became the holders of the center of the real power network: land, people, and monasteries. They didn't speak the language of bloodline. They spoke a new vocabulary: vassal, oath, fief. While the Robertians quietly accumulated power, the Carolingians were busy arguing about succession, dividing land, and avoiding the Vikings. From Verdun to Mersin, every treaty that divided the land was a knife to the chest of the Carolingian Empire. Charles the Simple, who was restored after Eudes, was a king with a title but no power. When he gave land to Viking leader Rollo in 911, he signed the death sentence for the dissolution of centralized kingship. The Robertians did not oppose it. They remembered. They didn't need to usurp power. They just waited for the right time. Robert the Fair, Eudes' younger brother, was later elected king, but then he died in battle at Soissons in 923 while fighting against Charles the Simple. He died as a warrior, not for a title, but to protect the choices of the nobles, and that death opened a dangerous gap. His son, Hugh the Great, didn't demand the throne. He withdrew, strengthened his lands, expanded relations with the church, and continuously married into powerful noble families. He didn't claim the crown. He rebuilt the kingdom from the roots. The Robertians didn't revolt. They supported the Carolingians when needed, elected kings when required, but preserved their lands and their reputation. Robert I, Eudes' younger brother, was later elected king, but then he died in battle. The throne was then handed over to someone, not his son. Instead of being angry, the Robertians chose a more enduring path: marriages, patronage, and building power from the ground up. When every other dynasty fell due to short-term ambitions, they became the last anchor for the panicked noble forces. A cloak and a name. In ancient Frankish legend, St. Martin's cloak was not just a sacred item. It was the protective symbol of the entire kingdom. Every time the king went to battle, a piece of the cloak was taken as a talisman, as if the entire church was protecting him. The cloak was preserved at the Saint-Martin-de-Tours monastery, a monastery that the Robertians had patronized since 865. No one expected that this quiet connection would create a name, Hugh Capet, meaning the one who wears the cape. Without a crown, without armor, Hugh entered history with the ancient cloth, even older than the throne itself. By 987, when the last Carolingian, Louis V, died from a fall off his horse, leaving no heirs, the nobles gathered and chose Hugh Capet, a descendant of Eudes and Robert I, not because he was the strongest, but because he was the most stable, the most central, and the easiest to control. They called him Capet, the man who wore the cloak of St. Martin, an old symbol but a resilient one, not passed down by blood, but passed down through action. No need for divine bloodline. Capet had a stronger political current flowing underneath. The Robertians were not extraordinary heroes. They didn't have grand campaigns like Charlemagne, but they were patient enough to survive and wise enough to plant seeds. From a count besieged by Vikings to a king dressed as a monk, the journey of the Robertians was a journey of persistence, not glory. And sometimes, in history, it's the ones who quietly stand behind that write the next chapter. When the power of kings dissolved in inheritance wars and Viking raids, Europe fell into a state of soft anarchy. No center, no direction. In that void, faith, not swords, became the only force capable of restoring order. The church was not just a place of prayer. In the early 10th century, churches and monasteries became the final system for preserving a structured society. They wrote history, upheld laws, collected taxes, and provided shelter for refugees. But these very places had also been secularized to the core. Many clergy were descendants of nobles. Many monasteries had been turned into political dowries and centers of local power. While lords built wooden and stone fortresses for self-defense, another spiritual flame quietly began to grow from the Bourgogne region. Cluny. Cluny, the beginning of a revolution. Without an army. In 910, the Cluny monastery was founded with a special rule. It was not to be under the authority of any local lord, but directly subject to the Pope. It was the first declaration for a church free from politics, serving only God and the poor. Under the leadership of abbots like Odin, Miolus, Odilo, Hugh, and Peter the Venerable, Cluny became the center of religious reform throughout Europe. They did not spread the faith with swords. They reformed through prayer hours, ascetic discipline, and the strength of faith. A network of monasteries, like roots of mushrooms spreading across Europe. Unlike the fragmented power system of the lords, Cluny created a centralized organizational model. Hundreds of new monasteries sprang up across France, Italy, Germany, and Spain, all following the Cluny rule and recognizing Cluny as their mother abbey. Some notable branches like Moissac, La Charité-sur-Loire, and Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire were not just places of prayer. They were also centres of education, agriculture, and culture. From there, Cluny reshaped the way of life in both rural and urban regions. If the feudal system was a web of interests, then Cluny was a network of sacred roots. Both coexisted side by side, but each shaped a different side of society. From here, the church began to speak a language more powerful than politics: salvation, moral order, and divine rights over secular kingships. Cluny wasn't just a sanctuary. It was Europe's plan B when the Carolingian dynasty was reduced to tired names on maps, and when local dynasties like the Robertians weren't yet powerful enough to extend beyond their regional borders. The church was the only force capable of binding the continent together. At that time, Europe had no common king, but it did have a common church, common rituals, a common liturgical calendar, and the monastery bells ringing at the same hour everywhere. And in the centre of it all, Cluny was the earliest beating heart. A different kind of power, not to rule, but to shape. Cluny emerged as a moral answer to an unstable era. While secular nobles were increasingly corrupt, raiding, taking monasteries, bullying the faithful, Cluny presented another example: moderation, discipline, and mercy. Many records from this period describe knights raping women in churches, destroying holy relics, and occupying abbeys. Cluny didn't remain silent. They turned patience into a strategy of reform. From the shadows, Cluny offered new definitions for the nobility. They were not just sword-bearers, but knights of Christ, milites Christi. They didn't just protect land, they protected the weak, the church, and pilgrims. Even the soon-to-be Capetian dynasty didn't dare ignore Cluny's influence. Hugh Capet, before becoming king, had close ties with the Cluny abbots and the reformist clergy. Some sources suggest his family indirectly patronized Cluny's northern branches. This was not just a spiritual alliance, but an ethical foundation to legitimize a dynasty with no royal roots. Because at a time when the sacred throne no longer stood, only the altar could still hold the sacredness of power. Cluny didn't ascend the throne, didn't conquer, didn't sign treaties, but it created a new moral framework for the post-Carolingian society. And while everyone else fought over land, Cluny sowed faith, like the last seeds of a civilization hoping to revive. In 987, a young nobleman, humble in stature, without any military achievements to speak of, and without the pure Carolingian bloodline, was elected by the great French nobles as king. His name was Hugh Capet. The reason he was chosen was very simple. He didn't threaten anyone. When the throne didn't need victory, but needed emptiness. The last Carolingians, like Charles the Simple or Louis V, had lost the glory of Charlemagne. They ruled in name but couldn't defend Paris, couldn't defeat the Vikings, and most importantly, couldn't control the lords. The French throne at that time was like a cold, gilded stone chair in an abandoned church, adorned with gold leaf, but cold and uninviting. No one dared to sit in it for fear of being stabbed from behind. The Carolingian dynasty, once powerful under Charlemagne, was now just a shattered name, no longer able to hold the duchies that were building their own power. Viking raids were just the final blow to a decaying body. After the death of Louis V, without a wife, without children, the nobles were faced with a thorny question. Charles of Lorraine, the last Carolingian bloodline candidate, was still alive, had an army, and had ambition. But he also had something that made the lords shudder. a desire to restore centralized power. They didn't want a new emperor. They wanted a king who knew his place and wouldn't challenge the power of the counts. Who would sit on the throne without taking away our power? And Hugh Capet appeared, like the quiet uncle at the family gathering, saying nothing, but chosen to hold the keys because he seemed gentle. A name, a cloak. History suggests he was nicknamed Capet because he often wore a cloak, kappa, a symbol of the clergy. It was no coincidence that his family controlled the Saint Martin de Tours monastery, where the sacred chape of Saint Martin was kept. From that, the name Capet not only referred to the cloth, but also symbolized the sacred protection, something that could both reassure the nobles and be hard to refuse. Not the crown, but the monk's cloth helped him ascend to the throne. History suggests he was nicknamed Capet because he often wore a cloak, kappa, a symbol of the clergy. Not the crown, but the monk's cloth helped him ascend to the throne. In the eyes of the nobility at the time, Hugh had no large army, no vast lands, and only controlled the Ile-de-France region, a small dot on the map surrounded by powerful duchies like Aquitaine, Normandy, and Burgundy. But it was this smallness that became the ideal political insurance. The soft power of a king who didn't intimidate. Hugh didn't rule with iron and steel. He did what no king before him had considered. He allied with Cluny. He solidified the loyalty of the clergy. He promised not to interfere with the rights of the great counts. And above all, he accepted the reality that royal power only lay within the royal domain. He was the first to turn weak power into something that could endure for the long term. And in doing so, he began to build a magnificent paradox, a dynasty of weak kings that survived for over 800 years. The strategy, be king, but not a monopoly. The coronation ceremony in 987 was held in Reims, the very place where Charlemagne had been anointed. No pope was present, but a large gathering of northern nobles was. This wasn't just a ritual. It was a perfect political script to rekindle the memory of the Carolingian Empire, but without evoking the fear of centralized power. Reims was the stage of memory, and Hugh Capet, with his cloak, did not recreate Charlemagne, but rewrote the role, the king friendly to the nobility. Capet didn't sit alone on the throne. As soon as he ascended, he made his son, Robert II, co-rule, setting a precedent, passing the crown while still alive. This prevented power struggles after the king's death and laid the foundation for the legal hereditary system of the Capetians. Not through military conquest, but institutional calculation kept this dynasty grounded. The subsequent Capetian kings followed his example, not seeking to reclaim all power, but slowly consolidating influence through relations with the church, strategic marriages, and propaganda about the divine right of kingship. When humility became a legacy, in a feudal society of violence, looking weak could be the only survival weapon. And while the great duchies fought each other, and knights stabbed each other over land, Hugh Capet sat there, not changing much, but with each generation, the throne dug deeper into the heart of France. And so, without war horses, without relics, the Capetian dynasty took root like an old but resilient seed in the heart of history. They chose Hugh Capet because they thought he would be easy to control. But it was precisely this non-threatening nature that made him irreplaceable. He didn't seize the throne. He was invited to sit in the empty seat. And when he wore the cloak and stepped into the throne, little did they know. They had just invited the founder of the longest ruling dynasty in European history. In 1031, Robert II, the son of Hugh Capet, passed away. On his deathbed, he didn't leave behind a mighty kingdom, but something peculiar, the reputation of a king who could heal diseases with his bare hands. It was at this moment that the concept of divine kingship began to take root in the minds of the French. The king, not just a ruler, but a man who touched the miraculous. The Capetian dynasty lacked military victories. They lacked territorial expansion. They lacked military glory. But there was one thing they slowly acquired: the story. A story whispered in monasteries, written in holy relics, spread through the markets, hiding in statues and hymns. The King of France can heal disease with just a touch of his hand. The disease was scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that caused swollen glands in the neck with pus, pain, and was seen as a punishment from God. Robert II, known as Robert the Pious, was the first king associated with this ability. The mechanism of legend. When the king became a living saint, Robert wasn't the only one rumored to heal diseases, but he was the first to make it a ritual. This ritual was not only repeated, it was recorded, recounted, and passed down as part of divine kingship. Monasteries like Saint-Denis and Fleury-sur-Loire played the role of communication, recording miracles and elevating them to national legends. These places didn't just preserve relics, they preserved the royal brand. After Mass, he would touch the sick and recite prayers. Those who were healed reported to the monks. Those who weren't healed believed they lacked enough faith. From the power of the sword to the power of faith, the Capets didn't strike at territories, they struck at the soul. And so, in popular belief, the king became the embodiment of God on earth, a symbol no one dared to openly challenge, for it would be blasphemy. From legend to institution, the power of ritual. From the 12th century onward, both the French and English kings practiced the scrofula healing ritual, but within two different ideologies. In France, the king was un roi très chrétien, the most Christian king, seen as the spiritual heir of Charlemagne. In England, the king was anointed according to the Church of England, but the power was increasingly tied to constitutional authority and secular law. Two bloodlines, two empires, both touching the divine expectations, but carrying two opposite political dreams. The successors of Robert, especially Louis VI and Philippe II, continued this healing ritual. By the 13th century, every coronation in Reims included a healing session for the people. It was not just an ascension ceremony, it was a magical event. The Capets didn't just build a dynasty with blood and steel, but with faith and custom. And this custom lasted until the time of Louis XVI, when the hand was lighter than the sword. The scrofular lumps, ulcerous, ugly, were the image of poverty in that century. But when a king laid his hands on them, not to feel disgust, but to pray, he placed the throne lower than the wounds of the poor, and sometimes power grew from bowing the head. The subsequent Capetian dynasties, Valois, Bourbon, didn't abandon this ritual. Even Louis XIV healed scrofula in hundreds of people in 1744 at Metz. Louis XVI, before being sent to the guillotine, was still called the Healing King by the people, even though at that time no one believed in miracles anymore. Once faith has entered history, it can outlast even the regime itself. In an era where every count built castles and dug moats, King Capet chose to lay his hands on the wounds of the people. The subsequent Capetian dynasties, Valois, Bourbon, didn't abandon this ritual. Even Louis XIV healed scrofula in hundreds of people in 1744 at Metz. Louis XVI, before being sent to the guillotine, was still called the Healing King by the people. even though at that time, no one believed in miracles anymore. Once faith has entered history, it can outlast even the regime itself. In an era where every count built castles and dug moats, King Capet chose to lay his hands on the wounds of the people. It wasn't divine power, it was a survival skill. If you can't make the counts fear you, then make the people believe. And thus, from hands that didn't hold swords, a new system of power quietly formed, on the backbone of faith. When Hugh Capet was elected king in 987, France didn't yet exist. There were no clear borders, no national flag, no national anthem, no Paris as we know it today, and certainly no map to colour in the Francia region. There was only one thing that existed, the idea that France could be nurtured, piece by piece, from a family that seemed the weakest. No land, but a centre. The Capetian dynasty began by controlling a small piece of land, Île-de-France, a narrow strip of land between the dense forests and the Seine River, with a few hundred villages, a few monasteries, and a handful of stone castles scattered among the fragmented feudal world. But they held on to something else, Reims, where the coronation ceremony took place, and Saint-Denis, where the previous kings were buried. That was the spiritual and symbolic core. In a world without nations, whoever controlled the rituals controlled the legitimate illusion. And behind the rituals was the church. Without a powerful army, Capet had bishops, people who were more familiar to the common folk than the local lords. No declarations of statehood, they had the Cluny monastery, where history was rewritten with ink and faith. If the king was the shadow, then the church was the one holding the lamp to illuminate the wall. Thanks to that, in the darkness of fragmentation and chaos, the image of the French began to emerge, faintly but hauntingly. No glory, but repetition. To build a country, Capet didn't use war. They used the perseverance of political habits. The king reigns, the son becomes co-king. He dies. The successor was already familiar to the people. He ascends the throne, a ceremony at Reims, buried at Saint-Denis, blessing with healing hands. It wasn't just continuity. It was a ritual repeated so often it became obvious. When the ritual became familiar, it turned power into destiny. Repeated so much that anyone who didn't follow the procedure couldn't be king. France was not built with blood, but with political memes repeated over the centuries. No monarch, but time. While England was in turmoil, the German monarchy fumbled with elections, and the Pope, the Capets, allowed time to work. They weren't the strongest, but they were the only ones who didn't fall apart. In Germany, kings were elected. In England, kings could be hanged. In France, under the Capetians, kings were familiar faces. The land didn't expand much, but the name Capet didn't crumble into pieces. Even when the dynasty nearly ended, even with weak kings, even with nobles demanding shared power, that bloodline endured. Each generation a little more, each king a new frame for the institutional castle. Empires born from conquest will die from conquest. Nations nurtured will live by memory and habit. While England was overthrown, and the German monarchy struggled with elections and the Pope, the Capets allowed time to work. The land didn't expand much, but the name Capet didn't crumble into pieces. Even when the dynasty nearly ended, even with weak kings, even with nobles demanding shared power, that bloodline endured. Each generation a little more. Each king a new frame for the institutional castle. Empires born from conquest will die from conquest. Nations nurtured will live by memory and habit. No one declared France was born. But by the early 13th century, the subjects in Île-de-France, Orléanais, Anjou, began to consider themselves French, living under the rule of the King of France, not because the king controlled them, but because the idea of the King of France had entered their sleep, meals, holidays, and even the church. No state has grown more quietly like this, and no dynasty has endured longer. In the world of the 10th and 11th centuries, everyone wanted to be strong. Everyone wanted to be the new Charlemagne. Everyone wanted to conquer lands, become a monarch, and rule with sword and cross. But France did not. Not through glory, but through survival. From Hugh Capet to Robert II, from Henry the Firm to Philippe the Fair, the Capetians did not win any major battles. There were no glorious campaigns, no heroic songs written into epic tales. They simply survived. Survived the Viking storms, survived the noble plots to depose them, survived the years of famine, division, and struggles over ecclesiastical power. And it was this weakness, seemingly helpless, that became the long-lasting foundation. Not conquest, but infiltration. While other dynasties fought for the throne with iron and steel, the Capets chose to infiltrate life itself. They existed through rituals, through donations to the church, through appearing in the dreams of the people as healers, through coronations, co-rulings, burials, and the procession of saints. Step by step, they didn't impose France. They planted France in the memory of the people. France was born from the acceptance of imperfection. When Charlemagne ruled, the Franks had the ambition of an empire. When the Capets took the throne, that ambition had rotted away, leaving a vacancy for something smaller, but more practical, a stable monarchy. No one chose the Capets because they were strong. People chose the Capets because no one else was better, and they didn't make war. What's called France didn't burst forth like lightning. It smoldered like embers, kept alive, not needing to blaze. Cracks that formed identity. The weakness of the Capets made them rely on the church rituals, patience, and collective memory. And it was these dependencies that made France different. A nation, not an empire, not a collection of lords, but the idea that there was a king of France, and he would always have a successor.